All right. So today I'm going to be doing a Vedic astrology reading of Ramana Maharshi's chart, the 20th century Indian sage born in 1879, became very famous as a wise, enlightened speaker of truth in South India. And Carl Jung once called him the whitest dot of white on the continent of India. And by that, he meant very pure in his teachings and energy, and perhaps the most pure example of an enlightened person who behaved in a very sage like way, whose shadow, you could say, seemed very minimal to non existent in a way. Um, but yeah, he's also sort of been a very helpful person for me to listen to, read his books over the years, and study all the people who knew him and everything they had to say about him. I actually ran a Ramana Maharshi study group for 2 or 3 years, and I've had a lot of experience with him and his teachings. So yeah, I have a lot of love for Ramana Maharshi. So this seems like a good person to do a video for. And this will be a Vedic reading. So his zodiac signs are 24 degrees, or actually 22 degrees roughly behind where they would be in Western astrology or tropical astrology, meaning based on the seasons. This is based on the stars. And yeah, and we're going to look at the nakshatras, the Indian signs for Ramana. That's and other techniques that I like to use. So, with all that being said, let's jump into it. So, first of all, his ascendant is in the nakshatra of Citra. It's right at the cusp of Virgo and Libra. And I looked up a few different birth times for Ramana, and they were all between 1 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. This one is right at 1:07, which I found interesting, which puts him right at the cusp of Virgo and Libra, just a few minutes away from it switching between back to Virgo. It's at the very beginning of Libra. Chitra is ruled by Mars. It's one of the three Mars-ruled nakshatras, and all three of them exist at the cusp of an earth and an air sign. So Virgo is all about bringing things together, attention to detail, hard work. There's this journey through the nakshatras of Virgo that have to do with just hard work to get to the beautiful final result of the outcome or the thing that's been created or discovered. And that's what Chitra is. Chitra is the beautiful discovered object of whatever, could be many different things. People who have an ascendant in Chitra often look very beautiful, and they can have a very heightened attention or very high level of taste of what is beautiful. And they might be someone who sells something that's expensive, whether or not they make it themselves. And so Chitra exists half in Virgo, half in Libra. So as Chitra moves into Libra, it's more about using this beautiful observation to come up with something else that's new and exciting. So it's using this beautiful thing as a basis for something new to be discovered. And the ascendant is in the third pada, or third part of Chitra. It's in the third section of 3 degrees, roughly, of Chitra. And so this pada, the third pada of Chitra, is all about it's the element related to it is it has to be air, which is in alignment with Libra. So it has a very exciting new energy to it. There's an excitement, there's an intellectual just kind of ease and flow state type of mastery and power of having Chitra in the third pada in Libra, because it's extra air. and it also has the beauty and confidence of knowledge of beauty. And so, yeah, so it's an interesting ascendant for Ramana. How does that relate to Ramana? All these things I'm saying here. I think it relates because he did have a natural comfort with the things that he found beautiful in the way that a Chitra ascendant always will. And, there's no nakshatra that's explicitly about materialism or one that's explicitly about spirituality or explicitly about good or bad behavior or anything like that. Every nakshatra, every sign, every planet can have different ways of manifesting itself. And it's part of the complexity and beauty of astrology to discover this, to see all the different ways that something like Chitra in the ascendant could manifest. But with Ramana, knowing his life, this Chitra, it doesn't Chitra is symbolized by a jewel. And for Ramana, he's not someone who's focused on literal jewelry or expensive objects or things like that. It's quite the opposite. But he is someone who found the true jewel, the true, very beautiful thing in the world to be one's true nature, to be what he called the capital S self. And there's other words for it in Sanskrit as well, like Atma. So another thing worth mentioning about Chitra is that it's the star that's used in this Ayanamsha, which is the thing that allows the sidereal or Indian zodiac or Vedic zodiac to exist. So the way that this is calculated 22 degrees and 10 minutes back, that this so-called Lahiri Ayanamsha, it's also known as the true Chitra Ayanamsha because it's based on a star that takes place in the middle of Chitra that's exactly at the center, it's about 3 minutes away from the center of Libra and Virgo. And once that's calculated, that's used to assign where, on the opposite side of the zodiac, where 0 degrees Aries would be, because there's no star in the sky that represents 0 degree Aries. And so this is the most common sidereal zodiac method that's used currently, is the Lahiri Ayanamsha, which connects to a star that exists almost exactly where Ramana's ascendant is, right in the middle of Chitra, at the middle of Virgo and Libra. So there's something very interesting about his ascendant being at the point of the star that's used to bring balance and a groundedness to what Vedic astrology is. This star was used by a committee at some point in the 20th century to decide for the country of India what the national zodiac timing system would be, or the national Ayanamsa would be, so that government nationwide holidays could be assigned or across the country. Because up till that point, different regions of India would have their own Ayanamshas that would have, a special holiday that's on a different day. And so if they worked for the government, it'd be harder to decide on what the day off would be for a national holiday. And so this Ayanamsha that's based on a star that's at the center of Chitra, which is it's really used to bring order to a large country, to a bunch of people. It's to allow alignment of the collective. And also moving from Virgo into Libra, this is the turning point from the first 6 signs of the zodiac into the second 6 signs, starting with Libra. And Libra is about knowledge of the other. It's about communication with community and the other. It's about the scales being used to measure value in the marketplace with different people coming and going. And so this star is used to allow, it's an actual measurement, much like the scales of Libra, that's used to allow a large quantity of people, a large and enormous community of people, the entire country of India and perhaps beyond, because I don't live in India and I'm using this Ayanamsha. And so most people in the world practicing Vedic astrology are going to use this Ayanamsha. It's the most popular one. And so this is, in a sense, Ramana is on the side, if this birth time is correct, or if he wasn't born, earlier than this. If he was born at 1 a.m., then it would put him in the Virgo side, which would have a slightly different significance. But going with this birth time, what it seems to signify is that Ramana actually has a teaching to give to the world that brings people together, that brings a consensus. A lot like the star brings a national and semi-global consensus about this Vedic Ayanamsha, the Vedic zodiac timing of where these planets go, or spatial location of where they go, which is related to time as well. So the spatial location of the star in the middle of Chitra that allows this all to take place, it brings everything together. And it's happened, and we're having this ascendant, and actually I believe that star is slightly before the cusp. I think it's at 29 degrees and 57 minutes of Virgo, I believe. So Ramana is on the other side of that star. He's on the other side of the center of Chitra in the third pada with his ascendant. And over here, it's not about laying down the law to bring everyone together, although it still is to a large degree because it's so close to it. But it's more so about, now that we've got that out of the way, we've got this logistical thing settled, which would have happened in the second pada of Chitra, the earth, the grounding in resonance with Virgo, the moving earth sign. Now that that earth is settled, now we can move on to exciting new things that, basically once you have your foundation set, then you can build a house, or then you can go off sailing. Once you have a home, then you can go off and travel because you have a home to return to. It's that kind of perspective that his ascendant in the third pada of Chitra would indicate. And it is about beauty as well. I mean, it's really about his deep love of, you could say, self-inquiry, meditation, surrender, even rituals. Ramana was just someone who found great beauty in pretty much everything. I remember there's stories of people visiting him who would sing or say poetry, and he would just cry. He just found beauty in everything, and his connection to animals. So he really was defined by his love of beauty, but the beauty that he found was in, the greatest beauty that he found and expressed was in knowledge of self and self-inquiry and surrender. Yeah. But in fact, he actually appreciated all forms of beauty, artistic and otherwise. He was actually very futuristic in for his time, in coming up with the analogy that so many spiritual teachers have used since him, of the metaphor of the movie screen and the projector, and how the projector is who you are, it's the consciousness, and everything that's on the screen is just like passing clouds, but you're actually always looking at a screen. You are the projector projecting onto the screen. You are also the screen that is being projected on top of. So at least that's one way of interpreting that metaphor. I'm not directly quoting him here because I've heard so many different ways of that being put over the years. But basically, Ramana had an appreciation for even film at the time. Someone came by that was a traveling cinema, basically, in the early days of this existing. And they showed a movie you can't even find anymore. Although there have been many other versions of it made, that I believe was based on one of the ancient Indian mythological stories. And Ramana and the community there, the ashram, really enjoyed the movie. And then he came up with that analogy that to this day, so many famous spiritual teachers use, like Rupert Spira, probably Eckhart Tolle and Deepak Chopra, although I'm not sure, but Byron Katie. It's just a very effective, thing, metaphor that has been used for the last 100 years. And Ramana thought of that like the first year that cinema was in existence, like basically, where he lived, which would have been within 5 or 10 years of its general existence in the world, I believe. So yeah, that's so that appreciation of beauty, and even in film or with music or with poetry. I mean, I haven't heard any story of visual art, but I'm sure. I mean, Ramana was an appreciator of beauty, and but he found the greatest beauty by practicing self-inquiry and other spiritual practices. So that's a lot about the ascendant. I don't usually go that deeply into just one part of a chart like that, but it seems worth doing because there's so much nuance here, and there's so many things like the star that allows the Ayanamsha, the cusp of Virgo and Libra, the third pada of Chitra. And so, yeah, from there, we would look at his moon sign. And in general, having, a really powerful ascendant like that, and then also having a very mystical, powerful, usually be the 10th house by traditional Vedic astrology you'd be looking to. So, because these are the angular houses. So his moon is not in the 10th house. However, it is in a very auspicious spiritual sign of Punarvasu. Now, this is a sign that can go different directions for different people, like all of them can. But in general, Punarvasu is about mystical, it's one of the most mystical signs of the whole zodiac. And it comes at the end of Gemini, which is focused on trying to figure things out. You go through this sequence of the nakshatras, Mrigasharsha, which is all about discovering and seeking beautiful things or ideas. Ardra is about combining knowledge and having a dialectic or heated debate, or a sort of harsh exchange of ideas and words to try to get to the bottom of something. Punarvasu is the bottom of everything. It's ruled by Aditi, which is the god or goddess of space itself, that all things exist within and come out of. And so it's pretty much the most cosmic nakshatra of the whole thing. And he has his moon right on top of the midheaven. It's at the end of the 9th house in the third pada of Punarvasu. So there's a direct trine relationship between his ascendant and moon and midheaven. So I put on this other view. You can see. Oh no, that's not true. No, it's not. It's actually a weak square relationship. I'm sorry. Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a weak square relationship. Let me just count this out. 1 to. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know why I thought that was trine. I guess, well, if it had, yeah, why did I think that was trine? Yeah, I was getting a little mixed up because actually his Venus has a trine relationship, but I won't go into that. I'll come back to that later. Okay, so, but in a different sense, yeah, it's not trine, it's square. His ascendant and moon are square. So there's a bit of a tension there, actually. There's a tension between what he would experience as beauty and then his mind and him being really great at that. Like he would actually be a great poet, and he did write some poetry, and he edited the book. It's called Guru Vachaka Kovai, Garland of Guru Sayings, which was really an homage to him and his teachings by one of his closest devotees, Muruganar, who was a famous South Indian poet that came to him and lived with him for a long time in the ashram, and they were, close friends. And he was a devotee of Ramana, and Ramana would go back and edit his lines of poetry. So it was more of a collaboration. And Ramana wrote a few things that were on his own. He would edit quite a few things other people would write based on what he would say, but he actually did write some devotional poetry himself as well in different I can't remember exactly what the poems were. I think he probably did one for Arunachala, the mountain. But anyway, so there's a tension between his excelling at all things involving beauty, appreciation thereof. In theory, he'd be great at creating beautiful things as well, and seeing the value of things that people would consider beautiful. But then his mind is in this realm of the cosmic. And this is what he's known for, because it's right on top of the midheaven. And the midheaven is the midheaven is the thing someone is most known for. It's the thing that's most apparent to the world. In fact, the ascendant and the midheaven are both that. And so having the moon right on top of the midheaven means that his mind, his actual mind, would have been seen by everybody. And to this day it is. I mean, he has an incredibly well documented mind, you could say. And this isn't true for all gurus, I mean, or all sages and spiritual teachers. Many of them speak in kind of riddles or koans, or they have a certain teaching they say, and then in private, there's a whole different type of person that you would experience that is more personality. It's more a different part of their personality that would come out when they're not speaking or teaching their stuff. But with Ramana, there really was no difference between him and any time. He didn't have any like time when he was just teaching. I mean, there was times of the day when people were welcome to ask questions, and that was kind of arranged by the other people at the ashram, and Ramana had nothing to do with that, or very little to nothing to do with that. And of course, there were many years where he was just sitting in a cave before then, and in isolation for the most part, and people would sit around him and feed him and things like that. But he didn't have an idea of like, now I'm going to teach. He would just respond to what showed up around him. And as people started to show up around him, asking him questions, he obliged and would answer their questions, but not all the time, sometimes. But if people talked to him when he wasn't just sitting around people, and maybe he was cooking vegetables, or he was walking around the mountain, which he did every day, Arunachala, he was the same person, like all the time. He wasn't a different person. He had the same personality, the same apparent personality, I should say. And in the deeper sense, Ramana had a deep understanding of how his mind was not him, and how his mind was just this thing that did what it did. And he found this process of self-inquiry and taught it to people that comes from other teachings from previous sages, like Sri Shankara, and I guess Patanjali, and goes back to really, it goes back to the Upanishads and some of the Vedas. But basically, the idea of just being the self, the idea of neti asking oneself who they are, and as an answer comes up, no, that can't be who I am. Oh, I'm this person that has a mind. No, that can't be it. So then who am I? If I'm not this body and I'm not this mind, who am I? And this is the teaching of Ramana, and this is what he's known for. And having his moon on top of his midheaven shows that he's in Punarvasu at the end of Gemini. This shows that he is known for really having a deep mental perspective, that his mind was existing at the level that was pre-mind of space itself. And in his case, this is also in the end of the ninth house. So the ninth house indicates law and religion, and sort of bringing things of the world together, because the seventh house is about discovering other aspects of the world and people and relationships. The eighth house is about the mystery that is discovered as you meet those people and places in the world. And the ninth house is about bringing all of that together, combining those factors. And that is often seen in spiritual practice that is religious or devotional or known out in the open, where the eighth house is more mysterious. And So yeah, the moon in Punarvasu in the end of ninth house, it really indicates that his mind was at this advanced spiritual he's known for his mind was practicing advanced spiritual practice, meaning he was getting the full result of what spiritual practice can offer for anyone, but he was, designed and destined to receive that full achievement of samadhi and what he called sahaja samadhi, which sort of surpasses the idea of a temporary state or experience, or it comes prior. It's in realizing the self that is prior to all experience and states. So yeah, I mean, this it's in the third. The moon's in the third and midheaven, or in the third pada of Punarvasu, which again is um, that's the air sign in an air sign of Gemini, and so that's very auspicious. And the reason why I was thinking there was a trine relationship, because I was confusing how the ascendant is in the third pada of an air sign within an air sign, but actually, yeah, that appears to be the way that all the air signs begin and end. So Citra, his ascendant is in the first Navamsha, which is dividing a sign into 9 parts, and it's representative of the divisional Navamsha chart or D9 chart. But he has his ascendant in an air sign within an air sign, you could say, and then his moon is also in an air sign within an air sign. And we can see this if we click on the D9 chart here, and we could look for the ascendant is at the beginning of Libra, an air sign still, and then his moon on this chart is in Gemini, which is also still in the midheaven. So yeah, so and I forget the word for this, but when you have an ascendant or any planet that's in the same spot or the same sign on both the birth chart and the D9 or Navamsha chart, this is very auspicious. It shows that there's a lot of consistency and depth to these placements for the person. And so for Ramana, there was just, there wasn't this big hero's journey growth where he started out as a criminal or started out very confused, depressed, or ill, and had to overcome these challenges to realize, the spiritual knowledge, or a story like Eckhart Tolle, where he, was suicidally depressed, and then he had this epiphany that how could he hate himself or not be able to live with himself, because who's the one that can't? He had this awakening through his deep depression. Eckhart Tolle did. Ramana had his awakening, his apparent awakening, as the story goes, when he was 16, I believe, after his uncle died, and then he was just contemplating death while lying on his uncle's bed, and he felt something, kind of happen, and he just imagined that he might be dying, and if he were to die, who would he be? Was he his body? Or was he his mind? And when he inquired into this question is when he had his awakening. And it didn't come after years and years of suffering. And he was only still a child when this happened. He was 16 when he had that awakening. And then his story goes on from there. And you could watch one of the many Ramana biographies or bio documentaries on YouTube. There's quite a few good ones now. I think the one called Abide as the Self is my favorite still. But there's a newer one that's really good too. I forget what that's called. But yeah, it might be called Jnana. I can't remember. But yeah, so that moon in Punarvasu is really showing he's known for his mind because it's on the midheaven. It's in this 9th house of spirituality. It's in the air part of an air sign of Gemini in Punarvasu, which is very deep. It's not something that's figured out the answers. It's something that has accepted the space behind the question. And that's the essence of Punarvasu at the end of Gemini, especially. And so he also has Ketu here in conjunction in the second pada. And Ketu is more, neurotic. It's the south node of the moon, and it is focused on an obsessive aspect that can bring great dedication to something, can also bring an out of control OCD neuroticism to something that could be unhealthy. But you could see for Ramana, he had a great deal of focus. You could use the word obsession, perhaps, but he had a great deal of dedication and focus to his practice of self-inquiry, of sitting meditation in the way that he did it, and surrender and devotion and abiding as the self, as he also put it. So that Ketu together with the moon in Punarvasu, and the Ketu being at a lower degree, shows the basis for his mind really being seen as so cosmic in its expression and focus. The basis for that is in the earth aspect of Punarvasu, which is going to be more grounded in the obsessive, highly focused and not dedicated isn't quite the right word, but the very focused and maybe obsessive practice of sitting and meditating or self-inquiring or some other form of spiritual practice. Like when he was younger, he used to light candles in the local ashram for all of the different dozens or hundreds of South Indian saints and things like this. So he had a very dedicated spiritual practice that was almost obsessive, you could say, that actually may have led to his deep perspective and knowledge. And not everyone's going to agree with that, but the chart does seem to indicate that could be the case. I mean, otherwise I would just have to see it as a total coincidence and meaningless thing that Ketu and the moon are in conjunction here in Punarvasu, where, I mean, the whole concept of astrology is that nothing is coincidence. Everything is synchronicity and has some, especially when it's standing out like that, like a close conjunction like that at such a prominent space. So I think there is some kind of obsessive quality that in somebody who perhaps had like more challenging karma to deal with in a life, their obsession in Punarvasu might make them very ungrounded. And if their moon wasn't also there, or if they had other things in their charts that would mess with it, then it would maybe just make them unable to function in society easily, because they'd always be thinking about cosmic things. Or, it's like when people see like these new photos that have come out of outer space from the James Webb Telescope. Some people, when they see photos of the vastness of space and the trillions of stars, some people think, wow, this is so beautiful. Other people think the total opposite. They think, oh my gosh, like this means that we're meaningless and nothing matters. And it makes them depressed and feel confused. It's the same way with meditation. I've heard one person say they don't like meditating because they don't want to face that emptiness. But Ramana, lived in the emptiness, and the Punarvasu is that spacious, empty space. Yeah. So this reading feels so complete with every small piece of it, but we'll continue. Like, it doesn't even feel like I need to continue it, but we will. So the next thing we look at is the sun, which is almost in opposition to the moon. Not quite, but within about 10 degrees of being in opposition. So there's an interesting, just in terms of the zoomed out view of this chart, we can see the ascendant is always going to be in the middle. That's what the ascendant means. It's basically the horizon of the chart that divides the night from the day. And then we have the moon on the midheaven at the height of the chart. And we have the sun in the third house in the subterranean, the depth of the chart. I think it's called the nadir of the chart. The moon would be near the zenith of the chart. And so the sun, which signifies the soul's expression, the moon signifies the mind. The sun expresses what the soul is really here to do in this life. In a way, it's like the dharma. It's the thing that one is here to do, the action, which is, karma means action, but dharma means what one is really destined to do. They're very similar, dharma and karma. They're intertwined. And so the sun is in Purva Ashada in the third house. So third house is very ambitious, very energizing. Purva Ashada is very ambitious and energizing in the middle of Sagittarius, which is very ambitious and adventurous and energizing. The sun is very receptive to all of that. And so this means in Ramana's deepest expression of what he was here to do in his life, there was actually an ambition that he was destined to live up to, basically, or that he had the opportunity to, and he did live up to, which was, in his case, to share this knowledge of self-inquiry, basically, and to become such a famous sage of Advaita, Vedanta Advaita, or Jnana Yoga, or whatever you want to label it as. But his teachings, it's interesting because Ramana's not thought of as a very ambitious person. He's thought of as a very subdued, kind of relaxed person. But in his deepest self, deepest self is not definable. And then that's what self-inquiry is all about. But in the dharmic role that he had in that body of Ramana Maharshi, the expression of his life was focused around something very ambitious, actually, that was very energizing to him. And it was below the horizon, so it's not the thing that would be seen by everyone. It's the opposite. What everyone would see was how cosmic his mind was. But the deeper part of his mind, or soul, you could say, was actually deeply ambitious in wanting to express these things correctly. And you could think about how he actually did put a lot of time and energy into editing this epic piece of writing by Muruganar, Guru Vachaka Kovai, and so many other things. I mean, I think he revised the Who Am I document, that's the most famous and widely disseminated thing he ever wrote. I think maybe the first thing, or one of the first things he wrote, or co-authored, or edited. I can't remember exactly how it was composed. But I remember that he revised it like 10 years in, or maybe 20, 30 years in, at least once, maybe twice. I can't remember. But it shows that he had an interest in getting these things as accurate as he could, because he knew they were going out to people, and he would want these things to be disseminated. He wouldn't turn anyone away. He wasn't an evangelist, and he wasn't known to like try to be famous or anything like that. But once these things started to naturally flow, as far as this is the role that he was taking on, he was very, I don't think ambitious is the right word, but according to this, it could be, because this sun is in the first pada of Purva Ashada, and that's the fiery pada with sun in a fiery sign of Sagittarius. Purva Ashada is ruled by Venus, and so there's a sense of beauty as well with Purva Ashada, much like there is with Citra. So there's a sense of wanting to really capture the beauty of what one is trying to do with this nakshatra. And and then you could also see he has Rahu here. So this is in opposition roughly to this whole section on the midheaven. I mean, Rahu and Ketu are always in direct opposition because they're the south and north node of the moon. But Rahu, the north node of the moon, is in I guess that's in the fourth pada of Purvashada. Let me confirm that real quick, because it's pretty close to the cusp. Yeah, it's in pada number 4. You can see there of Purva Ashada. And yeah, so this means, and that would be the watery part of it. I guess what that means is he did get frustrated by all of the things that would happen around him. You know, he didn't really like all the attention all the time. He didn't like just the different dramas that would show up. He would have to he would intervene in ways that were very appropriate and wise, and every occasion I've ever heard. But he didn't seek that out in a conscious way. The sun represents more the unconscious in a way, but it's deeper than unconscious. It's more like one's soul's purpose in this body, in this lifetime. So he just had this destiny that he surrendered to, where he had to get things right, where he had to use this energy that was flowing through him to express ideas clearly and to help manage his community at the ashram fairly and effectively and wisely. And he and other things that are a little bit more up for debate or interpretation, such as, to what extent was he intentionally transmitting anything to anyone else at different times. No one has the answer to that, and Ramana never said he did anything like that, because he would always acknowledge the power of the divine or the power of the self that everyone truly is. And yet you could be in a room with, a serial killer, or you could be in the room with a wise sage that's been meditating and living in a samadhi like bliss for decades, and you're going to feel a very different energy in their presence. So the energy of being around Ramana was, in a sense, ambitious and very activating to people and stimulating. It may have not been a direct conscious transmission on his part, but if it was, no one would know, because it's here in the bottom half of his chart where all this ambition lies. That's very close to his IC, opposite of the midheaven, the MC. And the IC is very hidden to the world. It's somebody's private life, somebody's private mind and whatnot, or even their unconscious. And so all of this ambition and energy, because the third house is all about energy and courage and communication. And so all of this was really his highest expression, where in a sense, Ramana, some people might consider that Ramana came into this life already enlightened, or he was so close to experiencing something called enlightenment. But he didn't, but in a sense, that was kind of the easier part for him to just come into this life, and his mind was already naturally going to be obsessive in the direction of spiritual practice in the realm of deep, deep, deep cosmic Punarvasu spaciousness that could have taken any form, and no matter how he would have done it, his mind would have been highly, highly advanced based on that moon positioning, as well as the other factors I've mentioned. But then when it comes to the sun, that's the direct opposite of the whole chart. It's the opposite sign, it's the opposite house that Gemini is in. So it's in Sagittarius in the third house instead of the ninth. So instead of being about, spiritual things, bringing the world together, his soul is more in this ambition, courageous energy to sort of just do something from a personal perspective. But this would be hidden from the world. He wouldn't speak that way, but he would know internally that he had a dharma to fulfill in terms of spreading the message of self-inquiry, basically. And so that sun in the third house in Purva Ashada, and then there would be some drama that would come with it, and that's the Rahu at the end of Purva Ashada, because Rahu is really about external drama and chaos that comes around. So yeah, so it makes sense why he really wouldn't be that into his position. Like he even at certain times, like at one time he told somebody close to him that he felt like he was an animal in a zoo, the way people would come to him and treat him, and he didn't like it. He just wanted to be alone and sometimes, but rather than running away and isolating himself, he would actually stay present for all of the people who came to see him. And he did that all the way until the end of his life. Even the final week of his life, when his body had cancer, he was still taking the time for people to see him. Even the final day he was alive, people would come by and see him in his room. I think the other people in the ashram might have even advised against that and said that they didn't want people to come see him because they wanted him to save his energy. And I think he wanted to just fulfill his destiny and role all the way up until his final day, which is incredible. So yeah, that's what we would call the big three of the chart, as in terms of the ascendant, the moon, and the sun. We also covered the nodes in Ramana's chart, the south and north nodes of the moon, also known as Ketu and Rahu. Now from there, the next thing I'd like to look at is the ruler of the chart. And so the first thing I'm going to look at is this a day chart or night chart? And it's a night chart because the sun is below the horizon. So then we would see if the moon is in a angular or succedent house, which it's not, which means the moon cannot be the ruler of the chart based on that. Then we would look at the sun as a secondary possible, actually it's called the predominator of the chart, and except the sun is also in a cadent house, meaning it's in a house prior to the angular house of the fourth house. 1, 4, 7, 10 are the angular houses, and the ones that come after are succedent. The one that comes before are called cadent. And the cadent houses do not allow it to be the predominator of the chart. So then by default, the ruler of the ascendant becomes the predominator of the chart, so which we were going to need to look at anyway. So the ascendant is in Libra. It's at the beginning of Libra, and Libra is ruled by Venus. So Venus in the second house is the ruler, or is the ruler of the ascendant, and it would be the predominator of the chart. And then the ruler of the chart itself would be the ruler of the sign Venus is in, which is Scorpio, and that would be Mars. So that would make Mars the ruler of the chart, and Mars is in the seventh house in Aries. So now we get to look at what this all means. So the ascendant is in Libra, and we already covered how the ascendant is in Citra. So the ruler of the ascendant is Venus in Vishaka at the very beginning of Scorpio. And it has a, I forget what that aspect is called. I think it's like a semi-sextile, or maybe, but it's a 30-degree relationship between Venus and the ascendant. You can see that. And because the ascendant's at the very beginning of Libra and Venus is at the very beginning of Scorpio. So Venus is about a sense of beauty. And so we already covered how his ascendant in Citra is also about beauty. Funny enough, Chitra is ruled by Mars, and we'll get to Mars in a second. But Libra is ruled by Venus. And so Venus in Vishaka is about different things coming together. And Scorpio is about deep mysteries. And it's in the second house, which is about wealth and speech and the things that somebody has as their assets that they come into life with. And so this is echoing his ascendant in Chitra, having Venus as the ruler of the ascendant, because Venus is about beauty and Chitra is about beauty. And Venus in Vishaka, the fourth pada of Vishaka, Venus is expressing, which is the water aspect. So now we have a water sign within a water sign. Again, just like we had an air sign within an air sign. Actually, I think I'm just realizing something right now about how every sign ends and begins with the first and final 3 degrees of it with a matching element, meaning the very beginning of every water sign and very end of every water sign is going to have a watery pada or navamsha. And that would apply to all 4 elements for all 4 types of signs. So that's just something I hadn't noticed recently, or maybe I hadn't thought about before. So Venus in the water part of Vishaka, in the water sign of Scorpio, at the very beginning of Scorpio, at the very end of Vishaka, it's representing an experience of beauty, finding beauty in deep mystery. and finding beauty, which is Scorpio, and finding beauty in the coming together of opposites, or the seeing through the apparent paradoxes of reality. So that's really what this fourth pada of Vishaka and first 3 degrees of Scorpio are all about. So his chart is in Chitra, which is all about finding beauty, and it's ruled by Venus, that is all about experiencing beauty in deep knowledge and the resolving of opposites. So it's just echoing this cosmic, spiritual, mysterious, deep knowledge. And the ruler of his ascendant being in the second house indicates that that's kind of his asset, that's his wealth. The wealth that Ramana comes into life with is, and experiences in life, is his lack of confusion, in terms of the 3 qualities of life, the 3 gunas of tamas, which is more inertia and delusion, rajas, which is more fiery ambition, and sattvas, which is purity, stillness, and wisdom. This shows a very sattvic element between his ascendant and the rulers of the ascendant, and the placement of the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, because it's showing that his experience of wealth is very sattvic. It doesn't have to do with ambition in a worldly sense at all. It just has to do with an experience of beauty in the as above, so below, in the thing that is apparently worldly and the thing that is apparently spiritual. And he can see, finds beauty in both, because he doesn't see opposites, but he also finds the deepest beauty in self-knowledge, of course, which would be shown elsewhere in the chart. But it reminds me of this famous Shankara quote that Brahman is reality, the world is illusion, the world is Brahman. So having Venus in the final this placement of Venus at the end of Vishaka, at the beginning of Scorpio, I would say is very much the embodiment of that Aja, or keep forgetting his name, Shankara quote that Ramana was once asked about, where he said most people get kind of caught up in the first 2 lines of that, where they're focused heavily on Brahman as reality and the world as illusion. And he said very few people can comprehend or come to the 3rd line of the world is Brahman. And so that's the paradox that has to be resolved and seen through. And the fact that the ruler of his ascendant is Venus in that sign in the 2nd house shows that he has a sense of beauty around that apparent paradox, where if Saturn or Mars was in that same placement, there would be more of a frustration or edge, perhaps, to that kind of deep reality. And so, or it would just be expressed in a harsher way, perhaps. There's different ways that can show up. But so we're calling Venus then the predominator of his chart, which sort of means like it's the captain of the ship of the chart. And this is a ancient Greek technique that I'm applying here. So that's sort of like, in a sense, that's the ruler of his chart. It's the captain of the ship that is the chart. But then the actual ruler of the chart is the ruler of the predominator, Venus. Because the ruler is the one who sends the captain out to sea. That's the metaphor from the ancient Greece astrology here. And so the ruler of the predominator is Mars, because Mars rules Scorpio, and Mars is in Aries in the 7th house. Mars is in its own sign of Aries. It's in about, 17 degrees of Aries in Bharani. And Bharani is like a very focused, committed, and dedicated, plodding kind of part of Aries, where it's just really on fire and doing what it's here to do. Mars is very fiery and ambitious, and it's in its own sign of Aries, which is fiery and ambitious. And so we have this very dedicated, yang energy applied to the seventh house, which is focused on the other, which is interesting. So what's really behind Ramana's sense of beauty and resolving the opposites of Venus and the end of Vishaka and the beginning of the mysteries of Scorpio in the second house, what's underneath all of that and what truly rules his chart beyond that is this actual, you could even say, a Rajasic energy of some sort, some kind of fiery energy, you could say, to meditate or to do self-inquiry or to seek until he found what he wanted. When he laid down on that bed and did this exercise, you could say, of, you know, imagining that he was going to die and asking himself if he was his body or his mind. This had a very intense yang Rajasic energy behind it. It would have to. It had a clear intention and energy behind it that allowed him to break through to the realization that stayed with him the rest of his life, that inspired him to meditate and sit silently as he did, and also to communicate and share his knowledge as he did. And so Ramana actually, this does show at the core of Ramana in a sort of personality sense, because this chart is about the personality Ramana and the incarnation as Ramana. It's not about the self, the capital S self that Ramana is speaking of. This is just, you could say, about the body, the karma of the body. But in this sense, the karma of the body and the significance of Ramana is fundamentally a more yang masculine energy approach to spirituality. And Ramana would say that self-inquiry and surrender were two sides of the same coin. And he said that different people, you know, just were naturally inclined more towards one than the other. And I read this wonderful book once called A Woman's Work, about this woman. I can't remember her name, but she kept great diaries, and this book was all based on her journals and diaries, where she would bounce back and forth between living in Ramana's ashram and living in with Anandamayi Ma, who lives very close by, or not too far at least. And so she would travel by just a short train ride or something, or car ride and she would just stay with Anandamayi Ma for a few months. Then she'd stay with Ramana and his ashram for a few months. And she would sort of just question in her mind, which one did she relate to more? And I think ultimately she actually related more towards Ramana, but she loved both of them deeply. And I imagine a lot of people in South India who had the ability to travel and were seekers probably had a similar story. And even now, people have similar stories where they might bounce between different perspectives on spirituality, different practices in spirituality that seem different or seem like maybe they can't even coexist. And yet this again comes back to this Venus at the end of Vishaka, where the apparent opposites, you know, from the highest perspective, the truest perspective, are not in fact opposites. The world is God, even though the world is illusion and God is reality. The world is Brahman. And so all that being said, at the end of the day, at the core of Ramana's energy, there was this strong masculine drive to really accomplish what he set out to accomplish. And he probably saw that as a very natural, harmonious flow that that didn't require too much effort on his part, even though it did. I mean, he wouldn't talk about how it did. I mean, but it did. I mean, he was very dedicated in his practice. And, you know, that was what he was naturally drawn to do. But I mean, anyone who has Mars in the middle of Aries is going to be very good at doing what they want to do in some way or another. That's going to show up as someone who's very effective at what they are inspired to do in general. It's just, you know, a really strong energy there, as well as having the sun in the third house in Sagittarius. That has a similar energy to it too. And if I just jump and look at the aspects real quick, we can see there's this really strong trine relationship between that sun and the area of the chart that Mars is in. It's actually connecting to I guess, Chiron and Neptune more than Mars, but and you could see this little shape here that points down to his Jupiter in the fifth house as well, that we can look at in a second. But yeah, I think this is really the key to the whole chart, basically, is that Ramana had a passion to really do what he set out to do. Now, the fact that it was in the seventh house, the fact that the ruler of the seventh house is Mars as well, which is in the seventh house, um, that's a little curious, because I'm not sure what the spiritual, non-romantic, non-sexual interpretation of the seventh house is. I haven't seen a chart with someone like Ramana Maharshi before that has a Mars placement in the seventh like that in Aries. But first, we could notice as well that Neptune and Chiron are together there, and Chiron has the woundedness that's being put to good use. Neptune has really high-minded spiritual ideas that could be delusional as well, that aren't really fully fleshed out. Neptune has a sort of a veil-like aspect to it that's veiling the actual true knowledge. And so there's an interesting combination of things happening there in the sign of Bharani, which is about dedicated consistency towards achieving a goal. It also is about death. And so you could say it's about ego death, because it's ruled by Yama, the god or goddess of death. I forget the gender. But basically, all of that being in the seventh house, it's a pretty harsh and intense combination as well. So it just might not be so great for relationship. I mean, Ramana just was, by all accounts, celibate and had no interest in sex or romance as far as it's ever been documented. He only spoke about these things as being things that would take away from what his true love, which was capital S self and self-inquiry and surrender. And in a way, I mean, his beloved was the holy mountain of Arunachala, and it was just all of the different manifestations of the divine as he surrendered and devoted and had different rituals that he would participate in too. But yeah, so having Neptune there's this the passion would be towards something very spiritual and elevated, and the fact that his guru was a mountain that was considered the embodiment of the divine in one of its forms. I forget if it was Shiva or Krishna. It was one of the two. I think it was Krishna. But regardless, this passion towards a spiritual ideal of the other that is synonymous with the self, because again, this goes back to Vishaka and the collapsing of the idea of opposites and paradoxes being resolved. So yeah, his passion and his romantic desires were really all in the direction of ego death and spirituality and devotion. And that's really represented by the death aspect of Bharani and the spiritual aspect of Neptune and all the other interrelationships that I've discussed so far. And Chiron, in this sense, like the woundedness related to all this, I mean, part of spiritual awakening is facing all of one's shadow and all of the inner wounds that come up, and then really acting as a healer and helper to others because of your own vulnerability in that kind of space. And it brings to mind one story of Ramana that's not too well circulated, where somebody was complaining to Ramana, somebody was going on and on and on about the problems of their life. And then Ramana said, like, you don't know about my problems. Like, do you know how I fell down like the mountain when I was climbing last year? And like my leg was hurt and I was stuck like under a rock for like hours. And then it took like weeks or months for it to recover. And I was in pain, or my body was in pain, or however he put it. And then his mother was alive at the time when he told the story. And then she just started crying and saying, oh, Ramana, don't remind me of this. And so it's funny to think of that story of Ramana speaking just as someone who, I mean, I think in the context of the story, he was telling that story about Ramana as a character with his body, being hurt and alone and recovering from an injury and being in pain, he was telling that story to really snap this person out of their own sob story. And which is, and it's or it's just a very human response from Ramana. It's one of, I think often the more human responses from Ramana are not the most popular stories of him, because people like to sort of mythologize and deify humans. And Ramana, as a character, as a human body, was a human, but he was connected to the divine that he identified with. And he was a very miraculous, supernatural human as well, in many regards, based on many, many accounts. But he was also just human. And so his own woundedness would, exist because he existed in a body. And then that would somehow be related to his passion. He would put all of that energy or angst towards his practice. And this is something that we could see from the Mars being so important to his chart, being the actual ruler of his chart. It's also an important thing, like I said, to realize that not everybody needs to look to Ramana as the example to follow, or as the person to learn from necessarily. Like, Ramana was totally fine with anyone following Anandamayi Ma or anyone else. He didn't view himself or claim to have a better way of putting things or a better practice for other people. He only spoke from his own reality, his own experience. And he did say, the way he saw things, but he didn't tell people to not pursue a path of surrender if that spoke to them more, or to even just focus on having a family or doing something else if that's what they were passionate about doing. And so, yeah, that's Ramana's seventh house in a pretty high amount of detail. And then, so we still have Jupiter, and well, let's go to Mercury next. So Mercury in the second house in Jayestha is focused on long-term planning. That's what Jayestha is. It has like sort of the aspect of Scorpio that is, very patient and potent, with like the poison of the scorpion's tail, and it'll just wait to strike once, as opposed to Aries, where the other Mars ruled sign that's very focused on immediate, just go, go, go into battle. Scorpio is more like the general that waits to strike. And Jayestha is very much the part of Scorpio that's the most like that, at the end of Scorpio. And so the Mercury here, it shows that his mind, he had a very patient mind, that his thought process was not quick to really land anywhere. And this really served him well, basically. It shows up in a Earth pada or Navamsha, meaning it's in the second part of Jayestha, in the fourth degree. And so, well, actually, it might be in the first. Let me double check that. Yeah, it's in the second. That was right. Pada 2, Jayestha. So this means there was a very grounded element to how he communicated and how he thought in that served him really well in the second house. I mean, Mercury in the second house in Vedic astrology is very auspicious, because the second house in Vedic astrology involves speech. And so, and Mercury, among other things, is about speech, communication, as well as intellectual problem solving. And so, yeah, having a mind, or, well, the moon is the mind in terms of perception of reality, but Mercury represents the intellect and the ability to solve problems and communicate things. So this is a very good placement for Mercury at the end of Scorpio and Jayestha, in the second pada of Jayestha, that's an earth sign, because it really represents a patience, and a patience that leads to a very effective result that's very grounded in terms of how he communicated, what he communicated, and how his mind worked. So this just really speaks to how well of a, Ramana's remembered as one of the greatest spiritual teachers of all time. And he didn't even try to be a spiritual teacher, like by any obvious account. I mean, despite his son being in this ambitious Purva Ashada sign. But yeah, he wasn't the kind of person that was just obviously trying to be anything. He just naturally let things unfold. And when it was time for him to speak, he would be very effective with his speech. And also, he valued silence above all else. And so, having a Mercury in Scorpio and in Jayastha, in the earth part of Jayastha, there's also a very mystical silence element to that, because you're waiting to speak and you're okay with not speaking in that part of Scorpio and Jayastha. So yeah, I mean, some like Mercury and the sun, the nakshatra before Jayastha and Anuradha, it would be a lot more ecstatic, because Anuradha is more about ecstasy and bliss and love and kind of this beautiful erotic element to deep spiritual and mysterious realms, basically. But after that, we get to Jayastha, which is more focused, and so his communication was not coming from a place of ecstatic poetry, like perhaps Nisargadatta was. Well, he was famously a poet before he started teaching, even, or had his awakening. But yeah, and then some modern people I know, and even artists and musicians, might have things in Anuradha that can express the divine in a very ecstatic, immediate way, whereas Ramana's way was more slow, and maybe there's no communication because he valued silence as the highest communication. And when there was communication, it was very clear, very effective, exactly designed for the person he was talking to. He was very good with words and very patient. He didn't rush into anything in terms of communication or conclusions mentally. And this was one of his greatest assets in the second house, along with the Venus placement that I've already discussed. So that brings us to his Jupiter, which is in the fifth house of creativity, and his Saturn in the sixth house of obstacles and service. So starting with his Jupiter in the fifth house of Shata Bishak, it's in the nakshatra of Shata Bishak in the middle of Aquarius. So this shows kind of the really joyful side of Ramana that could really appreciate beauty and artistic things and poetry and songs and films that he saw, and just people in general. And it shows that he's a great teacher, because the fifth house is about education. Jupiter is about guru and teaching. Shata Bishak is really about problem solving and going through all the different possible solutions to get to the right one. In Aquarius, which is all about effective, long-term, futuristic, or very outside the box thinking, basically, that's effective ultimately. And especially here in the middle of Aquarius. So Jupiter is not necessarily so happy in Aquarius and Shata Bishak. There's a little bit of tension there, but I don't think that's too significant, because Jupiter is happy in the fifth house, and the significance of fifth house being about education and Jupiter being guru is very auspicious, I think. And having the Jupiter in Shata Bishak, it may just indicate that he's more of a reluctant guru, that he's gonna, and also he's not a very clear, focused guru in a way, because he would answer people's questions no matter what they were asking him. If they were asking him about chakras, he'd answer the question, or about astrology, he'd answer the question, even though none of those things had anything to do with what he was interested in, or his teaching, or what he thought was valuable for people to know. He was just incredibly accommodating to people that were interested in anything, and he always had an interesting answer for any question that appeared to be the thing that was exactly what they needed to hear at that point in their journey, which seemed very compassionate to speak that way. And let me see what pada that Jupiter's in real quick. It's in the third pada. Okay. Yeah. So that Jupiter in the third pada of Shata Bishak is going to be in the air sign, also in Aquarius, an air sign. So this shows that, and that's also the karma sign, which means there's some kind of desire there. So this actually, like Ramana was once, there's some story of these people that were sitting around him, some of his devotees in the ashram, and they were asking each other if they were ready to be a teacher themselves. And then Ramana just were like overheard them, and then they asked him, "Oh, Ramana, do you think we're ready to like teach other people and what we know or our experience has been?" And Ramana said, "Yes, you can all be teachers. You're ready for that if you want to be." And then he says, "But I wouldn't recommend it." And then they asked, "Oh, why not? Why wouldn't you recommend it?" And then he said, "Because your compassion will force you to water down the message that you want to share." And that very much represents the karma pada of Shata Bishak and the air sign, and perhaps the airiness of Aquarius and Shata Bishak as a whole as well. Because, I mean, Shata Bishak is called 100 doctors or 100 cures. And the idea is you go through 100 different cures or doctors to get to the one you need. And that's very different than the type of guru, perhaps if we were to consider his, what if his Jupiter was in the ninth house? And what if it was in, something else, that was just more auspicious for Jupiter in general, like Cancer or Sagittarius or Pisces. Then we might have a more traditional form of teaching that would, no matter what people would say, he wouldn't have this compassion, as he put it, getting in his way of giving people the most, helpful teaching, basically, that he really believes in himself, that's worked for him. Whereas his compassion, if somebody really wants an answer about something that he doesn't think is really that valuable to them, if they want to have self-realization or enlightenment or ego death, any of these types of things, which was really what he was known for himself and what people would come to him for. And yet his compassion would allow him to just give these 100 answers, these 100 cures, with knowing that everyone's on their path, and eventually they get to the self-inquiry, or eventually they get to a place of silence and peace, and their mind just slows down. And that he didn't feel it was his role to, try to convince people to, make that kind of change in their approach to spirituality before they're ready, you know. And so, which is very wise, it's very wise. But as far as the how much does that make him a guru, it makes it a little more vague, because is a guru someone that just answers people's questions, or is a guru someone that directs people's thought process and focus of action in a way regardless of their questions? Like a true Ramana was a true guru, but when he was giving his most direct teachings, he would tell people, hey, like, just find out who's asking the question, whatever their question was. He would say, well, if you're coming to me, just what the best thing I have to tell you is to just ask yourself, who's asking this question to me or to anyone? Like, who are you? Basically, he was asking them to practice self-inquiry. But if they were like, yeah, I know what you mean, or I don't know what you mean, but I really want an answer to this question that I can put in writing. And they were like, okay, well, here's my answer, and then, so yeah, just a little bit of, that Jupiter in Shata Bishak and Aquarius in the fifth house. It's very interesting. And it does speak to the type of teacher that Ramana was, that he was most certainly a teacher, but he was a teacher that had 100 cures and 100 different doctors, in a sense, in his answers, even though his actual teaching was so simple and direct, which is shown everywhere else in this chart we've talked about. I mean, really in that moon in Punarvasu, especially, as well as that Mercury in Jayestha. Yeah. So, and the ascendant in Citra. Yeah. So finally, we'll just look at the Saturn in direct conjunction with his part of fortune in the beginning of Ravati at the end of Pisces. So Saturn in the sixth house is pretty happy. In Pisces, not so happy. In Ravati, which is ruled by Mercury, It's kind of, yeah, just neutral, and but maybe not too happy either. But then he has good fortune, so right on top of it. So it's a really interesting contrast that in the house of obstacles, of enemies, of injuries, of, you could say, the correction of the individual just before they go up to the horizon of the other in the seventh house. So, oh, and again, all of a sudden it's become much more clear to me that the seventh house is about devotion towards Arunachala and all the other embodiments or forms of the divine that Ramana was very devotional towards. So that's where his, you could say, it was like a redirection of all of that second and fourth chakra energy just going towards devotion. In terms of sexuality and romance, which would be the manifestation of the seventh house for most people, especially with a very empowered Mars and Aries. But for Ramana, this was all redirected towards the spiritual with Neptune and everything else going on in his chart that would make it much more cosmic and spiritual and elevated to up, transmuting and moving through the energy of the chakras all the way through the crown chakra, and then back down into the heart for ego death, as he has put it. So that's just another quick reflection on Mars now that I could see that more clearly somehow. But okay, to finish up this reading, just looking at this Saturn and part of fortune placement, the part of fortune means good fortune, basically, and fulfill. It's a lot like the 11th house, which is the house of good fortune. That he has Uranus and Purva Falguni, which shows his actions and his ambition that we have down here going on in the third house. Is there any aspect there between these two? Yeah, there is a little. Yeah, actually, there is a lot between that Sun and that Uranus. There's a total trine happening, and there's this kite formation that's going right between that Uranus and the Jupiter in the fifth house. So his guru aspect going into the ambitious activity of Uranus in the 11th house, which is about good fortune and gains and dealing with groups. Purva Falguni is very like fiery, ambitious, and focused on beauty as well. And so Uranus is explosive. So he's having really like incredible, awesome gains in his life through his ambitious teachings, in a sense, you could say. And that's very clear when you look at this kite formation and the trine relationship down to his sun and the ambition there that I spoke of earlier. And this also connects to the spirituality of that Neptune in conjunction with the Mars. And finally down to this this Jupiter I just talked about, which is the guru aspect, which is creative and educational in the fifth house. So yeah, that was another tangent, but very interesting to notice all of a sudden. And so to wrap this up, the Saturn and part of fortune, which I went on that tangent because I was saying the part of fortune is sort of echoing the same significance of the 11th house, if you're not familiar with what the part of fortune means. And so it's just a positive result of one's actions, basically. So Saturn, much like Jupiter, is in a slightly uncomfortable sign position, but it's happy in the house it's in, because Saturn in the sixth house is like Saturn knows how to deal with obstacles because it takes its time and it's focused on the limitations of reality and whatnot. Like when Ramana, there's a story of him getting stung by a bunch of bees. He accidentally stepped in a beehive, and his response was to just walk very slowly and not run away from them, because he said, well, I messed with them by accident or whatever. This body affected them negatively, and they're just, fulfilling the cycle of karma. So I'm just going to let the karma play out. He's not going to run away from it and literally run away from the bees. He'll actually let the bees sting him until they get bored of stinging him. And then he just walks away, or he slowly walks away. And so, yeah, because he accidentally stepped in a beehive that fell down. And there's many Ramana stories that are similar to that have to do with this aspect of surrender. So this sort of implies to me that Saturn in Revati has a very or in Pisces perhaps even, has a very surrendered aspect to it, because Pisces is very spiritually advanced in its understanding of reality, and Saturn is too. But Pisces is a little bit more exciting, and Saturn is a little bit more like it's about the rules, so it's less exciting. It's about the limitations. Pisces is more about the infinite possibilities, and which includes limitations, though. And sixth house is about limitations, and Revati is about just an understanding of everything in reality, and how that could be applied to one's physical benefits or any benefits. I mean, Revati is kind of the peak of Pisces energy in a way, and it's really all about rebirth and learning from the whole process of reality that has come prior to it to affect whatever outcome one wishes to affect. So the good fortune that comes in this sign shows this is just the good fortune of Ramana's chart, that he experienced great fortune actually by understanding the cyclical nature of reality and the limitations therein because of Saturn and Revati in relationship here. And this is where he found great fortune, the greatest fortune by, any standard really, other than a very materialistic one that would be just more delusional. Ramana was existing in a reality that is true reality of his true self, for all consciousness, that was very enjoyable and pleasant and allowed him to overcome obstacles and threats to his health. And then when his body was ready to die, there was no resistance to that. So in a way, he wasn't fighting against the disease when it came. He would just let everything play out, and he found good fortune in letting everything in his life play out naturally, where he didn't try to fight against the tide or the Tao, the flow of life, ever at all, basically. And this is echoed with the predominator of his chart that I mentioned, the Venus at the end of Vishaka. I mean, very, very powerful placement of finding beauty in the resolving of the opposites of Vishaka, in the mystery of Scorpio. And then the silence of the Mercury at the end of Scorpio and Jayestha. And we've covered everything in this entire chart, except for, might as well wrap it up with the last two little things here, the Pluto and Lilith. Not things that are usually looked at in Vedic astrology readings, but as you can't tell by now, I have my own style. But Pluto in Critica, Pluto is about really fiery, explosive, transformative change as well, similar to Uranus, except Pluto is a bit more mysterious and dramatic and actually less fiery, but more just kind of quantum in a way. It's very mysterious and very powerful. And so Pluto is in the 8th house, which some in Western astrology would consider it the natural ruler of, if they consider Pluto the ruler or co-ruler of Scorpio, which would be the natural sign to the 8th house, except we have Pluto here in Taurus in Critica. And it's in the second pada of Critica, which would be an air sign. So it's in a air earth mix energy. So this Pluto, it's in the house of mystery, and it's very grounded in the house of mystery. And this just shows that there's great transformational, power shifting perspectives in the house of mystery for Ramana that give him energy, because Critica is all about raw energy. It's symbolized by fire, which is cutting, and it's this thing that can purify. It's this thing that can fuel. Fire is the essence of everything, much like Punarvasu is the space that everything is held within. Fire is the essence of the energy that comprises all form, including space itself. And so there's this interesting, Critica can sort of be thought of as the fundamental masculine or yang principle of the universe, where Punarvasu could be thought of as the most spacious, feminine, receiving aspect of the universe. Punarvasu being one of the 4 or 5 most feminine signs. I wouldn't call it the most, unless you look at it from that very cosmic perspective, but which is almost beyond it's more non-dual than feminine, because feminine denotes a duality, but feminine also denotes non-duality more than masculine in a certain way, if that makes sense. Which is a bit of a tangent, but all of that is to say that Critica is the masculine yang principle of the chart, but it's at the beginning of Taurus, which is a feminine sign. It's in the air pada of Critica, which is more masculine. So this is just kind of adding extra energy. It's echoing what we already see with the Mars in Aries, really. So this Pluto in the second pada of Critica in the eighth house, that eighth house placement is also echoing everything I said earlier about the Scorpio placement of Venus and Mercury, really. And so, meaning Scorpio and the eighth house are both about mysteries. And so, this transformative, energizing element from the house of mystery with Pluto, it's just, it's just more fuel for the fire. It's really just, it's showing that Ramana's chart is fired up by this masculine energy, this pranic energy of life from Mars in Aries, the actual ruler of the chart, by this ancient Greek, I guess, astrological approach that I find very effective. And then finally, we'll just look at Lilith and Rohini, which is very interesting. I mean, I think in a very, I don't actually practice too much astrology that's focused on very, I guess, superficial interpretations. That's not the right word, though, but I guess mundane. I'm more interested in the karmic, dharmic, and psychological, and I don't know, and the more cosmic aspects of astrological reading. And in terms of things that are more mundane and everyday, it's not the thing I'm most interested in at the moment. Although anyone who's interested in a reading, you're welcome to contact me, and I could give you a reading, but it would specialize more in the more dharmic, karmic, and cosmic aspects, and even mental, psychological, emotional aspects of a chart. But with all that being said, Lilith in Rohini is the most feminine nakshatra of the whole zodiac, speaking of masculine, feminine. And so, much like Aries goes into Taurus as being the most masculine of the 12 zodiac signs, into Taurus, the most feminine, we also have Critica going into Rohini, mirroring the exact same sort of thing, where Critica is the most raw masculine energy of fire. Rohini is it's like the high priestess tarot card, and it's just about feminine beauty and pretty much, and sensuality. And having Lilith in here, I think, just shows that he's just not likely to have sex or be focused on sex in life at all, because Rohini is very sexual and sensual, and it's in the middle of Taurus, the bull, a very sexually potent animal, and Lilith is called the dark node of the moon, and it's kind of the wounded part of femininity in a way. It has a woundedness to it. So having that energy in the high priestess house, or not house, but the high priestess nakshatra of Rohini, it's kind of total, it's like a total opposite energy thing that just doesn't work, where there's going to be a great discomfort with sexuality around women, or great discomfort that could just naturally lead to a total disinterest completely. That's not saying Ramana was like this shy person that wanted to have sex with women and felt uncomfortable about it. It really just means he didn't have interest. He had other interests in his life, and if that ever did come up, he probably just wasn't interested, or it probably did make him feel uncomfortable if it came up. But then he would just have other things that would make him feel very excited and comfortable, that he would redirect energy towards, such as the moon in Punarvasu or the Mars in Bharani, in Aries. So yeah, it's not surprising, but it's an interesting indicator to look for in other charts, because in Vedic astrology, this black moon Lilith is not really looked at. And so this is a new technique that could be applied to see if you see Lilith and Rohini, it might mean the person is really going to have low interest in sexuality with women, at least, or in general. If it's a female-bodied person, it might come across different. But for a male-bodied person like Ramana Maharshi, who Um, yeah, it just shows he probably wouldn't have much interest. But it's interesting is that Rohini is about femininity and feminine beauty and sensuality and sexuality. And the eighth house is also about sexuality. And so you have these two signifiers here with Lilith, which is like the harshest, most wounded part of feminine energy. So it's just it's not an auspicious combination for sex, basically. So, and neither is Jupiter in in the fifth house, but in Aquarius necessarily, because Aquarius is going to be a little more harsh, and so it means he's less likely to have children or be focused around sex, even though he has all of this abundance of energy. It's more likely to go in a direction of teaching or creativity, I'd say. So, yes, that is the end of this reading. That was a full reading of Ramana's birth chart. We did not look at any divisional charts because I haven't been doing that in these videos. In private readings, I like to look at a D60 chart, or